When Frank Zappa passed away in 1993, his eccentric Hollywood Hills estate, known by locals as the Zappa Compound, remained in his family for decades. The sprawling, almost maze-like house had been filled with Zappa's instruments, tapes, and odd decorations, giving it a reputation for being as strange and unconventional as the man himself. After years of legal disputes among the family and financial struggles, the property was finally sold in the mid-2010s. The buyers were a couple from New York, David and Laura H., both in their early 40s, who worked in entertainment law and real estate development. They were drawn to the property not only because of its history but also because of its secluded, artistic aura. The house itself was unlike any other. Multiple levels twisted into each other, stairways led into unexpected hallways, and there were hidden rooms tucked behind bookcases. The basement was rumored to be where Zappa stored thousands of hours of recordings, some still unreleased. Despite being remodeled before the sale, much of Zappa's personality still lingered. Brightly painted walls, hand-built furniture, and strange murals on ceilings. At first, David and Laura treated it as an eccentric but charming home. Friends would come by, fascinated by the place's history. They would joke about how it still smelled faintly of incense, even though no one had burned any. But soon, the house began to feel less like a quirky monument to a rock legend and more like something alive. Laura was the first to notice it. At night, when David was asleep, she swore she heard music faintly playing somewhere deep in the house. It wasn't anything recognizable, no famous Zappa tracks, but odd, experimental sounds, almost like someone was tuning instruments or playing with recordings. She would walk through the house in the dark, barefoot, trying to locate the source. But whenever she reached the room where she thought it was coming from, the music would stop. David dismissed it at first, chalking it up to old pipes or even distant neighbors. But then he had his own experience. Late one evening, he was in Zappa's old office, going through shelves of dusty boxes left behind in a storage room. He found reel-to-reel tapes stacked neatly, many labeled with cryptic titles. As he carefully picked one up, he heard the faint sound of someone clearing their throat directly behind him. Spinning around, he found no one there. Yet the air in the room felt charged, heavy, as though he wasn't alone. The disturbances grew worse. Guests complained of sudden headaches when staying overnight. Their dog refused to enter certain rooms, growling at what seemed like empty corners. Lights flickered in the studio space even after electricians confirmed the wiring was sound. On more than one occasion, Laura said she saw a figure moving in the reflection of the glass doors, tall, lean, with wild hair, only for it to vanish the moment she turned her head. One night, the couple invited a small group of friends to have dinner in the house. During the meal, the stereo system in the living room switched on by itself, blaring static before cutting to a warped, looping guitar riff. Everyone froze. David scrambled to shut it off, but when he pulled the plug, the sound continued for several seconds, echoing through the house like a mocking laugh. The new owners eventually learned from neighbors that even when Zappa was alive, people swore the house felt strange. Delivery drivers hated going up there after dark. Neighbors sometimes heard sounds at odd hours, music, laughter, or even arguments when no one seemed to be home. Despite renovations, despite their attempts to normalize the property, the house resisted. It carried Zappa's imprint too strongly, as though he hadn't left at all. Today, David and Laura still live there, though they don't speak about the haunting publicly. Friends who visit say the house is beautiful but unsettling, as if the walls are listening. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the Hollywood Hills are still, the faint sounds of an experimental jam session seem to drift through the walls, music that no one living has ever played. David and Laura had been in the house only a few months before they stopped treating the disturbances as amusing quirks. At first, there was a novelty in living inside a rock legend's home, and their friends loved the eccentricity of it. But as weeks turned into months, the strange details of the house, the crooked staircases, the unusually narrow corridors, the way some doors didn't quite fit their frames began to wear on them. It wasn't just the architecture that unsettled them, but the sensation that the house seemed to resist their presence. Laura noticed it most at night. The property sat high in the Hollywood Hills, with a sweeping view of the city below, and from their bedroom window she could see the grid of lights stretching endlessly. It should have felt calming, like being above the world. Instead, the silence of the house wrapped around her like something alive. She would lie in bed listening, straining her ears to separate the creaks of an old structure from what sounded like the faint scratching of instruments, a guitar string being plucked slowly. Then silence. Then a low hum as though someone adjusted an amplifier. She told herself it was her imagination. But the sounds always came when David was fast asleep beside her, and when she got up to walk through the darkened hallways barefoot. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though she were walking into a room that had just been vacated by someone unseen. During the day, David busied himself with renovations. He had an obsession with restoring Zappa's old studio in the basement, where a chaotic mess of cables, microphones, and soundproof panels had once stood. Most of the equipment had been sold or donated years before, but the space still bore the marks of decades of recording. He would spend hours down there, prying open cabinets filled with yellowing papers, handwritten notes, and reels of tape labeled with cryptic words like clown tape, take 3, or graveyard jams. What disturbed him wasn't the existence of the tapes, but the feeling that they had been deliberately left there for someone to find. The handwriting on the labels seemed almost too deliberate, too performative, as if meant to draw the eye. One afternoon, while alone in the studio, David decided to test the reel-to-reel machine that had been left behind, though it hadn't been used in decades. He connected it to the wall, fully expecting nothing to happen. But to his surprise, the machine whirred to life, the spools turning with a soft hum. He threaded one of the tapes, marked simply with a red X. What came through the speakers was not music, it was a soundscape of metallic banging, muffled voices, and what could only be described as laughter, but not the laughter of joy. It was slow, distorted, and deliberate, the kind of laughter that feels too close to crying. David yanked the tape off and sat in silence, sweat on his forehead, convinced that what he had just heard wasn't recorded in a studio but captured from somewhere else entirely. That night, he didn't tell Laura. He tried to bury the incident, convincing himself it was just Zappa's odd experiments, artistic noise, nothing more. But the house wouldn't let him forget. Guests began noticing things as well. When their friends Paul and Monica came over for dinner one Saturday, they both felt ill within an hour of stepping inside. Monica described a sudden migraine that hit her like a wave. Paul swore he saw a figure pass by the glass doors leading to the back patio, a man with long hair moving quickly, almost impatiently, though when he looked outside, the yard was empty. Neither of them stayed the night. The couple's dog, a golden retriever named Milo, reacted most strongly. Once an easygoing animal, Milo had become increasingly anxious inside the house. He would bark suddenly at corners, his hackles raised, or refuse to go down certain hallways. On several occasions, he stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, whining softly, his eyes fixed on the shadows below. It got to the point where Laura began carrying him out the front door just to get him outside. Laura herself began experiencing something stranger than sounds. In the reflection of the kitchen window, just as the sun was setting and the glass turned dark, she thought she saw movement behind her. It was never direct, just the fleeting impression of a tall, lean silhouette, shoulders slightly hunched, hair that seemed to flare outward as though caught in a breeze. Each time she spun around, the kitchen was empty. But the moment she looked back into the glass, the figure was there again, waiting just behind her shoulder. By the time autumn settled in, David and Laura were sleeping in separate rooms. Not because of marital strife, but because the house seemed to encourage it. Laura had become restless, waking constantly, insisting she heard music drifting through the vents. David, exhausted by renovations and plagued by his own unease, preferred to close himself off, often falling asleep in the studio chair surrounded by boxes of tapes. And yet, despite everything, neither of them made a serious move to leave. The house had a grip on them. They would talk about selling, even laugh about how crazy they were to stay. But whenever the subject became serious, something always stopped them. A sudden distraction, a change in tone, as though the house itself had redirected the conversation. It was during one of these late-night silences that Laura, standing by the living room window, finally whispered aloud. Frank never left. She hadn't meant to say it. The words slipped out like something not entirely her own. David, overhearing from the hall, froze where he stood. And from somewhere deep in the house, perhaps the studio, perhaps nowhere at all, came the faint sound of a guitar string snapping, sharp and metallic, echoing through the silence like a warning. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The nights grew heavier inside the house, as though the air itself thickened after sunset. Laura found herself wandering the hallways when she couldn't sleep, the wooden floors creaking softly under her bare feet. Each corridor seemed longer than it had in daylight, as if the house stretched when darkness fell. She carried no light with her, relying only on the dim glow from outside street lamps filtering through the windows, and it was in those half-lit passages that she began to feel the most watched. Not by something crouched in shadows, but by the very walls, as though the house itself had grown eyes. She started to notice little things out of place. A chair pushed slightly away from the table when she swore she had left it flush. Books rearranged subtly on a shelf, their spines leaning inward to form new clusters. In the mornings, when she walked into the kitchen, the faint smell of cigarette smoke sometimes lingered, though neither she nor David smoked. The smell was sharp and acrid, the kind that clung to clothing, and it seemed to come from nowhere. David, meanwhile, had given himself over completely to the basement. The tapes consumed him. He told himself he was cataloging them for historical purposes, maybe even to sell or donate later, but the truth was he couldn't stop listening. Each reel felt like a fragment of a larger puzzle. Some were bursts of chaotic noise, layered instruments clashing, feedback that went on for minutes. Others contained snippets of conversation, voices half-murmured, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in tones that bordered on hostile. And then there were the ones that unsettled him most, recordings of silence. Whole reels where nothing but faint static played for hours. Yet, when he sat there in the dim basement, David swore he heard things within that static: breathing, a cough, even once the distinct sound of a chair scraping against a floor, as though someone else were present in the room where the tape had been recorded. His obsession began to bleed into his sleep. More than once, Laura found him slumped in the studio chair at dawn, the machine still running, the reels turning lazily long after the tape had finished. When she tried to shake him awake, he was clammy and pale, muttering incoherently about voices, telling him where to go next. She stopped asking him questions, afraid of the answers. It was the dog, Milo, who seemed most in tune with whatever haunted the house. He began refusing to enter the living room altogether, as though something invisible blocked his way. At night he would sit in the doorway, whining softly, his ears pinned back. On one particularly quiet evening, as Laura sat reading in that same room, she watched Milo fix his gaze on the far wall. His body stiffened, and he gave a low, guttural growl, the kind she had never heard from him before. Laura followed his stare and saw nothing but shadows. Yet, for reasons she couldn't explain, the hairs on her arms stood on end, and she found herself whispering, "Who's there?" into the emptiness. The house seemed to answer. The lights flickered once, sharply, and then steadied again. Milo barked, loud and sudden, before bolting down the hall, leaving Laura frozen in her chair. Neighbors began making quiet remarks. One older man who had lived nearby for decades pulled David aside one afternoon, speaking in the kind of hushed tone reserved for secrets that weren't meant to leave the block. "We all used to hear things when Frank was alive," he said. "But after he passed, it got worse. Sometimes in the dead of night, you'd hear music from here, not from speakers. It sounded like it came out of the ground itself. My wife wouldn't let me walk the dog past this place after dark. Said it carried something with it." David laughed it off at the time, but the words lingered. That evening, when he returned to the basement, he found a fresh tape waiting on the reel-to-reel machine. He was sure he hadn't placed it there. It was unlabeled, its surface smudged as though handled recently. He debated leaving it untouched, but some compulsion overrode his hesitation. When he pressed play, the sound that emerged was unlike anything he had heard before. It began with the faint strumming of a guitar, gentle and almost hypnotic. Then came a voice, raspy, deliberate, murmuring words he couldn't quite make out. As the minutes stretched, the guitar dissolved into static, and the voice grew clearer, though distorted. It seemed to be repeating his name, over and over. David, David. He tore the tape from the machine, his hands shaking, but the echo of the voice stayed with him, ringing in his ears long after the basement had gone silent. Laura noticed his change almost immediately. He had grown more irritable, quick to anger, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness. She suggested leaving for a few days, even checking into a hotel just to breathe in different air. David refused. "I can't leave it," he said, staring at the basement door as though the house itself might punish him for abandoning it. One night, as Laura lay awake in the upstairs bedroom, she heard it again, the music. This time it was louder, clearer, a strange, spiraling riff that seemed to wind through the walls. She followed the sound down the hallway, her hand trailing along the cool plaster as if for balance. The music led her to the old office, the room where David had first found the tapes. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city outside. And there, against the far wall, she saw the outline of someone standing. Tall, still, hair wild in silhouette. Her breath caught in her throat, and she blinked, certain her eyes were playing tricks. But when she whispered David's name, the figure tilted its head not toward her, but as if listening to something else, some rhythm only it could hear. When she turned on the light, the room was empty, but the faint smell of smoke lingered, curling around her like an unwelcome embrace. By winter, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a vessel, carrying them somewhere they hadn't chosen to go. Laura spent her days in a kind of drifting haze, moving through rooms that seemed increasingly unfamiliar. The cheerful quirks that had once attracted her, the hidden nooks, the eccentric murals, the twisting hallways now felt oppressive, as though they had been designed to confuse and trap rather than delight. She caught herself forgetting things. A conversation she swore she had with David, only for him to insist it had never happened. An entire evening when she thought she had been sitting by the fire, only to wake and find herself in the upstairs bathroom, the water running in the sink. David, meanwhile, was nearly lost to the basement. His clothes carried the smell of dust and mildew, his hands stained with the oily residue of old tapes. He rarely came up to eat, and when Laura forced him to sit at the table, his eyes would wander, fixed on some point behind her, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. When she pressed him, he muttered about unfinished work, about recordings that want to be heard. The dog, Milo, grew thinner, refusing to eat unless Laura hand-fed him outside. Inside the house, he barely moved, his body pressed to the floor as if making himself smaller. He no longer barked. He only trembled. The worst night came at the end of December. A heavy rain fell over the hills, the kind that makes the roads glisten black and the canyons echo with runoff. The storm should have drowned out everything inside the house, but instead it seemed to amplify the sounds. Laura was jolted awake by a blast of music, loud, jarring chords reverberating through the walls as though the entire structure had become an amplifier. She stumbled out of bed, her heart hammering, and followed the noise down the stairs. The music led her, of course, to the basement. The door stood open, light spilling from below, flickering like candlelight, though she knew no candles had been lit. She called for David, but he didn't answer. As she descended, the sound grew clearer. A chaotic, swirling jam of guitars, percussion, and distorted voices. It wasn't coming from the speakers, it was in the air itself, vibrating against her chest. At the bottom of the stairs, she froze. David was seated at the reel-to-reel machine, his back to her, his body unnaturally still. Around him, the shelves of tapes seemed to rattle, as though some invisible force moved through them. One by one, reels tumbled off the shelves, clattering to the floor, their magnetic tape unraveling and snaking across the ground like black tendrils. "David," she whispered. He turned his head slowly, and in that moment Laura felt a coldness that went deeper than fear. His eyes looked hollow, ringed with shadows, and when he spoke, his voice carried a strange rhythm, as though syncing with the music around them. "He's here," David said. "He's been here the whole time, and he doesn't want us to leave." The words seemed to echo not just from his mouth, but from the walls themselves. Laura staggered backward, shaking her head. "We have to go. Now, we can't stay in this place." David smiled faintly, a vacant smile, and turned back to the machine. His fingers reached for the play button. Before she could stop him, he pressed it. The basement erupted with sound. Not music. Not exactly. It was a barrage of noise, discordant and overwhelming, rising in waves that shook the light fixtures and sent dust raining from the ceiling. Laura covered her ears, but it was inside her head, vibrating against her skull. Through the chaos, she swore she heard voices layered within the static. Laughter, weeping, fragments of sentences that made no sense, and then clearer than all the rest, the sound of her own name. "Laura!" she screamed, lunging forward to pull David away from the machine. But when she touched him, his body felt ice-cold, his skin damp as though he'd been standing in the rain. His eyes rolled back, and for a moment she thought he would collapse. Instead, he gripped her arm with a strength she had never known him to have. "You can't stop it," he whispered. The lights burst above them, plunging the basement into darkness. The sound cut out instantly, leaving a ringing silence so total it pressed against her chest. In that silence, Laura felt something move past her, a presence brushing against her shoulder, the faint smell of smoke curling into her lungs. She didn't dare turn her head. When the lights flickered back, the machine had stopped. The reels were still. David sat slumped, breathing heavily, his grip loosening on her arm. The room was a wreck. Tapes unspooled across the floor. Furniture shifted as though in an earthquake, but there was no one else there. No figure, no shadow, just the two of them. They left the house that night. Laura dragged David upstairs, grabbed Milo, and fled into the rain. They drove down the winding canyon roads with the headlights cutting through sheets of water, neither of them speaking a word. It wasn't until they were halfway across the city that Laura realized she was still shaking, her hands welded to the steering wheel. They never returned. The house remained, standing on its quiet street in the hills, its windows dark, its walls holding whatever had taken root inside. Locals say it still sits there, unsold, the property tied up in quiet disputes no one explains. And sometimes, on certain nights when the wind is low and the city hum softens, those who live nearby swear they can hear music drifting from the empty house. Not the music anyone recognizes, but strange, experimental sounds, half jazz, half chaos, rising faintly, as though the walls are still playing tapes no one should hear. Inside, the smell of smoke lingers, and the faint impression of a man's laughter, wild, unpredictable, unmistakable, echoes through the halls. Frank Zappa never left. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.